Well, this story doesn't start off with joy. It actually starts with an argument, a disagreement between Barnabas and Paul. Barnabas wants to take Mark along again on the next missionary journey. Paul disagrees because Mark deserted them. So they divide their ways. Barnabas and Mark go off to Cyprus. Paul takes Silas and they head out. They want to meet with the churches that they've already planted in Galatia. But as they go along, they happen to meet someone named Timothy, who joins their crew and becomes an assistant to Paul and Silas. They go diagonally across, finally running out of all land at Troas. It's there that Paul at night receives a vision. A Macedonian man, a man from Macedonia says, "Come over and help us." And so Paul, Silas, and Timothy are for the first time joined by Luke. We know this because the narrative of Acts changes from they to we. They all get in a boat and sail across the Aegean where we are today. And they land eventually in a place called Philippi on the mainland. Philippi is a colony named after Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great. And in Paul's time, it is a Roman colony with Roman soldiers. And because it is not a very large city at this time, it doesn't have a very large Jewish community. In fact, probably not even 10 Jewish men. That's why there's no synagogue in this place. So Paul and Silas and Timothy, Luke, they go outside the city to a river. And they meet a group of women, probably a few men, praying to the God of Israel. They meet a woman named Lydia. She's actually from Turkey, a place called Thyatira. She deals with purple cloth, which is very expensive at this time. So she's a businesswoman and Gentile and interested in worshiping the God of Israel. Paul explains to her the good news that God has come in Jesus Christ, the Messiah, and she opens her heart to the good news and becomes a believer. Paul baptizes her and her whole family and goes to her household. There she welcomes them and they stay, and that becomes the very first church that Paul plants in the continent of Europe. Well, Paul went about preaching in Philippi, and eventually he got the attention of a slave girl who was possessed by a spirit. And she followed them around saying, "These men have come here to tell you about the living God." While you'd think this might be a positive promotion for his gospel, it started to irritate Paul, so that eventually he turned around and cast the demon out of the slave girl. While this was good for her to no longer be possessed, her owners, who used her to gain money by her fortune telling, became angry. They seized Paul and Silas, dragged them into the marketplace, or agora, and started a riot, complaining to the magistrates about how these men had come to give unlawful practices about religion. The magistrates didn't even give them a trial. They stripped them, beat them, and flogged them severely, and then had the jailer throw them into the jail, and not just a jail, into the inner dungeon part of the jail, putting their feet in the stocks. You might imagine at this time that Paul and Silas would be miserable, but in fact what we find at midnight is the two of them singing praises and praying to God, and all the other prisoners listening to them. Suddenly, in the midst of their singing, an earthquake rattles the entire place, such that the gates are thrown open and their chains come off. The appropriate thing for the jailer to do at this point, thinking that all the prisoners had escaped, is to fall upon his sword. But Paul and Silas, who could have been cruel to this man, instead were very kind to him and said, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." When the jailer comes in and finds them still there, he asks them a very powerful question. "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Paul and Silas share with him the good news. "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved." He invites them to his household, where he washes their wounds, and Paul and Silas wash away the jailer's sins through baptism. The next morning, the magistrates tell the jailer to get rid of those two guys. But when it's discovered that Paul and Silas are Roman citizens, the magistrates are afraid, for they have punished them, persecuted them, without even a trial. So they kindly ask them to leave, and Paul and Silas say, no, you must escort us out of the city. As they are about to go, they first go visit the house of Lydia and the jailer, and it is to this small beginning, this little church here in Philippi, that Paul writes the letter to the Philippians, a letter of joy, to which he begins, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first to this day. And to them he also says, rejoice in the Lord always. This is a letter of joy that reminds us that even in the most difficult circumstances, we can have contentment through Jesus Christ.